So it's great to be joined now by David Russell, and in a moment, I'm going to invite him to tell us where he's from and the work that he does. The importance of this conversation today can't be minimized at all. I think the topics that David and I are going to cover are super important to the overall conversation about what society needs to know and do about sibling sexual abuse. So, David, it's great to have you here. Could you just give us a quick introduction?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm David Russell. I'm the development lead and service manager at Thriving Survivors, an organisation that we work and offer a practice service specifically around sibling sexual abuse, both for children and young people and for adult survivors that have experienced abuse in childhood.
And thank you for that. And one of the things that is important for people to recognize is that you see the impacts and the whole sort of storyline of sibling sexual abuse essentially walk through your door every day. So you have got the people involved at one level or another, whether it's the person who caused harm, the person who was harmed, the predominant being survivors. You work with survivors, but that doesn't minimize that you're involved with entire families who have been impacted by SSA. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what makes us quite unique as an organisation, is we offer support to the whole kind of family system, and we also work both with individuals who have been responsible for that harm as well, particularly children and young people. We really see the value in that prevention work to try and ensure that we're giving people enough support in place to really put a stop to potentially behaviours that are occurring in families. And that might be spending more time with parents and carers, exploring kind of support needs, also addressing some of the other issues that happen within life, such as that might be impacting on parental supervision or ability for parents to be at home. So that could include things such as financial pressures that we can provide supports with. So it's a real wraparound support. And within the service, we utilise restorative practice quite a great deal, particularly in working with families when requested and appropriate and safe, to kind of help family healing from the inside.
And I think that whole, as you say, wraparound approach is super important. And I know I've dealt with it in other conversations, whether it's in last year's Awareness Day or the podcast, the SiblingsToo podcast, that there was a time where professional intervention was predominantly either the survivor only, and then maybe the person who caused harm, and then possibly bring in the parents or maybe bring in the parents at some point. Now that's evolved, thank goodness, to this more wraparound, bigger picture approach. And where I know you and I are on the same page about, we also hope that these sorts of events that we're having today and the work that you do and the work that others are doing is actually going to extend that conversation out into the wider world as well. So society sees and understands, the community and society as a whole understands its role and its possible opportunities to not only be involved in the prevention of sibling sexual abuse, but sort of have appropriate narratives and be able to manage the understanding that this has occurred with people. Even if sibling sexual abuse were to stop tomorrow and it would never happen again anywhere on the globe, there are tens of millions of adult survivors and those who are currently children who will be adults in the near future who are still dealing with this trauma that's impacted their lives. So, I think we're, as a whole, we're recognizing the importance of getting everybody involved in this whole conversation. So thank you for sharing what you guys are doing in that broader concept, which I think is super helpful. I want to start our conversation today because on a article that recently came out in the Sunday Times in the United Kingdom by Decca Aikenhead, who has been on the SiblingsToo podcast in sharing her writing of this article and her journey as a journalist in creating that article. I personally think it was a great article in many ways, bringing awareness again on the grand scale. The Sunday Times is a reputable newspaper, and it's a broadsheet as well, so it's not salacious, so to speak, in its reporting of things. But one of the things that we want to be discussing is the language that we use around sibling sexual abuse. And one thing you and I agree on is that part of the language lent into the concepts of crime. So let's sort of jump into that and talk about the problems that that actually creates. How do you think looking at sibling sexual abuse is either good or bad in the overall conversation? Pardon me, look at it as a crime is good or bad in the overall conversation?
Yeah, I think it's a very tricky one in terms of when we start to really explore the use of language. And I think to be really clear, I think language should be guided and led by survivors themselves in terms of the language they want to use. But I think also to give that recognition, I think one of the things that concerns me slightly is when we use the word crime, is at times we know within sibling sexual abuse, it's a family issue. You know, it happens within the family. And often there's a significant amount of kind of emotional conflict, particularly with parents, in actually how to respond and who to respond to quickly and who needs the first response. So the issue for me in terms of using the word crime at times is actually when we start to define this, what we have to ensure is that people feel safe about disclosing this has happened in their family, because that's the first step, isn't it, in terms of ensuring that this is stopped, ensuring that people get the help they need, everybody in the family gets the support, and most importantly, the survivor, the victim, you know, gets placed at the kind of heart of that support. The fear for me is when we start to use crime as a term to describe the child who's displayed the harmful sexual behaviour towards a sibling, is actually the parents' emotional conflict. This may impact them taking this forward because of the fear of they desperately want to get help, but they don't maybe want to have a child criminalised. And I think that's really, really important. When I think of some of the contacts I've had, and I always think of one call in particular with a father where he described to me, I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. He's my son. I love him, but I'm going to kill him. Now, that point really is always stuck with me in terms of that emotional conflict. If this was a peer or a child out with the family, the word love probably wouldn't have came into it. It would have been like, I hate him, I'm going to kill him, what he's done to my child. And that raw emotion piece comes out. But actually, this dad had a connection to both children. He didn't know whether to phone social work. He didn't know whether to phone police. He didn't know whether to phone a family member. So he contacted us as a third sector organisation. And that really hit home to me. This person genuinely wanted to get help, but didn't know how or where to do it. Because I think what we will say is, in terms of sibling sexual abuse, it is incredibly different. I think when we see it and the impact that it has on everybody and the family system, now to address that healing, we have to get the support in place. If we criminalise that part, that may be a disruptor in allowing healing and support to come in and be embedded. So I think it is important that, you know, when we're working with this, we really take I personally feel a health approach first and foremost in terms of that child protection context when working with children and young people, to really look at that approach in a much wider context opposed to seeing it as immediately a place of potentially criminal justice.
Yes, if that's the first place that disclosing SSA goes, it's sort of like, oh, we must, or it more often than not is put in a criminal justice context. And yes, it is going to limit, and it has been shown in other jurisdictions as well, to limit the likelihood of people reporting, and because of precisely what you say, which must have been a horrendous call, not only for you to hear, but for the father to make. I can certainly understand that horrendous conflict, because when we also put things in the context of crime, anything in the context of crime, there's a degree of fear that shows up just because it's in that context. Not even, it all, the fear gets exacerbated as we start to pull apart what we feel the crime has been. Then it gets even worse, sort of thing. But positioning it first and foremost as a crime. And I've said in other places, and I'd love your thoughts on this, how you feel this plays out in society as a whole. I, as somebody who's interested in narrative psychology, we look at how as a whole, again, generally speaking, society would define certain things. So what pigeonholes exist for different concepts, and there's a pigeonhole that most people have in their head about the subject of wealth, being rich. People have an image of what that looks like for them. And most people share a similar image, live in a grand house, have lots of financial freedom and all the rest of it. That's their dictionary. But when we use any sort of term that includes sexual abuse, that the image that people have is a big brush of adult to child, monster, predator, evil person we see in the movies, let's just throw them all in jail. And one thing we know from all the research, and I'm sure you know from daily practice, that big brush definition of sexual abuse does not help. It really doesn't help, particularly if we put the word child in there somewhere. Sexual abuse involving a child, or child sexual abuse, or anything like that. This big brush comes out and includes somewhere a monster. It's almost like the monster has to exist if the term sexual abuse is in the conversation. So we make the person who causes harm the monster, who must go to jail or must at least be pulled out of the family. What are your thoughts on just this general idea that is the image that society holds, which is a difficult image for something like sibling sexual abuse to be included in?
Yeah, I think 2 points to that, Nancy. I think for me, one bit that you've really hit for me there is the problem is I don't even think it's when we talk about child sexual abuse. I think it's when we talk about the word child and sex in the same sentence that immediately causes anxiety, even if that's talking about sex education, healthy
Mm.
sexual behavior, sexual health. We see children in society as something that we have to protect, something that's incredibly vulnerable and delicate, which absolutely a lot of that's right. But we also sometimes fail to understand, and society fails to understand, that at a certain point, when does society decide when a child can become sexual? When does a child allowed to start to sexually experiment within peer groups? There's a real issue in terms of that, of an uncomfortableness of that. And the place I always go back to is if we're not comfortable talking to children and making children feel safe about sex in general and being able to talk about sex, ask these strange and wonderful questions that usually makes us redneck to answer, but we do it. I think for me, how come on earth can we expect a child to feel safe and come and tell us when something has been abusive? So I think, that's really, really an important bit. The other thing I think that you had mentioned in terms of the image of the monster, I always reference that term othering. So when we other people, when we put people into that other bracket, you mentioned at the beginning around, the services and actually, I still think there's a real issue with that in terms of certain organisations will only work with a certain type of person in the sexual abuse context. Whether that's an organisation that solely works with victims or whether it's an organisation that solely works with people that have caused the harm, I think for me, the risk of that at times is actually in the context of sibling sexual abuse, is that we start to show an imbalance of power and we start to show an inequality again, because we're saying that you've got that place to go and we'll go to this place. Now, actually, what we've been really trying to understand is how that family operates. And for me, it's important that that is under one house, that actually that support is connected in the same place. That allows things to happen quicker. It allows referrals to be processed quicker and at an even stage. And I think it also avoids that term of othering. When we're working with children, and I always think of years ago over the press and the media, where we think of children being really something again that we protect and are vulnerable. The minute a child falls out with that perfect image of what society thinks a child should do, we go to the other extreme and we demonize children. And I think that's unhelpful as well, because ultimately society's got a role to understand why a child potentially has formed these roots. And also, we have a responsibility as a wider society to challenge this, but also ensure that dialogue remains open and safe for people to come forward to seek support.
You bring up some fascinating points that I've probably thought of in a different way, but you say it so succinctly and so clearly, and I thank you for that, because you know, that idea that society has a role here, and part of that role to me is individuals within society, say, pausing to recognize how their sometimes knee-jerk responses, whether that's in their behavior or even in their thinking, actually goes against common sense. Because what you said is common sense. You know, we quite rightly sort of say, well, children are young and there's certain things that certain levels of protection for sure, but we must also consider that they are sexual beings from, in some ways, even before birth. So it's not like all of a sudden, oh, you're 18, so now you're a sexual being, you know, like it, and maybe, oh, maybe 16 now, so we'll drop the age of consent. You know, it doesn't really work that way. And that's complete common sense, but we tend to fall into these narratives without really thinking about it. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that creates real opportunities then, for society as a whole to play an integral role in the prevention of SSA, and you know, where it's happened, some interventions as well. Because I know for myself, and I've said this elsewhere, I think that it's amazing now, particularly, that survivors of SSA are now finding each other. And the next stage, you know, in Facebook groups and things like that, the next stage will be those that cause harm will also find each other to a degree, but less so. Those will usually be more constructed environments of therapeutic intervention where those who cause harm might come together. But the thing that for many, it's great to be validated and reinforced by fellow survivors or people who have experienced this. But when I can walk out onto the street and speak of my life experiences in a total conversation, so all of my life experiences, without worrying how people are going to judge me as a survivor of SSA, or squirrel up their nose, or say something really stupid to me, which I have heard throughout my life about certain things, that to me is when we're on a very healthy and hopeful path, when society can also hear what I have to say, not just fellow survivors. And I think what you're talking about presents the opportunities for society to participate in a person's healing in that way, to be able to hear these things and to be able to accept these things in people's past. As you know, I have the story portal at SiblingsToo.com, and people, I've got lots of stories of people who are telling me or the portal anonymously of their experiences, and they've told nobody else except for maybe a spouse. And they're now in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And to me, that's very sad that somebody has not been able to share, even with their best friend, out of fear of what that friend might think or do. And that's really indicative of how society just knee-jerk stuff. So your points, I think, are super important. And so where do we go from here then, do you think, in terms of applying what we're talking about here and making a real difference when it comes to not only language, but maybe let's bring up the topic of language when we're talking about gender as well, and you know, how gender and language sort of meet, but then kind of go, oh, and get all crazy when they get together. So what do you
Yeah,
think needs to happen next?
I think kind of back to the point we made around talking about healthy sexual behaviours. I think this falls into this area again, and it's a prime example of the need for good child-centred sex education. Is actually when we think of sexual informants and things that tell children about the world, I think one of the things we tend to do is we love a bit of blame. We blame everything for the problems that we face in the world. But actually, it's so easy to blame. But how do we address that? So for me, an example being there was reference in terms of sibling sexual abuse, kind of being presented on mainstream platforms such as movies, films. I think Game of Thrones was an example, which I'm sure has been mentioned a few times. The thing for me is absolutely we look at those things and we see them as a problem and we see the messaging as being a problem. But there's another part to that, and I think that role is as society and parents, and anybody that's in contact with children, does anyone actually tell them why that's so wrong or why that is so strange? And I think that's the issue, is we tend to blame, but we never take accountability of why there's been traction. Why is this actually allowed to take traction and people to become almost interested or motivated by this? Usually I would argue that because often there isn't somebody acknowledging that what someone's just seen and then confronting it and correcting the messaging. Opposed to that, we just blame it. We say how awful it is. We say how horrific it is. It's the same with pornography. You know, I would argue that over my practice, I've worked predominantly with young people that have displayed harmful sexual behaviour. And I think I haven't worked with probably a single one that hasn't at some point had some form of reliance or use on pornography. That doesn't mean I fundamentally believe we should ban pornography and make it illegal, because I think that's really naive. I don't think that's ever going to happen. The thing that I think is so important is that we support an understanding to the content that's being viewed, and we put in place those kind of themes that we're trying to get over to ensure that any traction that's taken from the content goes with a level of safety. And I think for me, I talk a lot about a harm reduction approach to pornography. I think it's, as I said, when children are developing at that age, the interest in pornography, I would argue, is normative. You know, we're going to see that it's there, the temptation's there. Is it time that we started to look at how do we support a harm reduction approach? Because pornography is so accessible, it's so mainstream, and absolutely the content is severe and ranges. So do we need to start thinking about how do we equip young people to be exposed to pornography, opposed to just blaming young people for looking at pornography? I think that's certainly one of the big things that I think is really, really important to tackle.
I agree, and I'm wondering if you're in your experience, in the breadth of your experience over the years. I've heard lots of stories of those, and reported when they were younger as well, but also as young adults, when they're talking about what might have been a part or a contributing factor to their harmful sexual behaviors. The pornography was their sex education because they weren't getting it anywhere else. Do you, not really, they weren't getting their questions answered. You are correct. I mean, parents, myself, I'm a parent. It's really hard sometimes to handle the questions that you're asked by your children. And then also we tend to say, oh, well, sex education in school should cover these things. Well, that's a whole other minefield as well. So in your experience, and I'm going to put you a bit on the spot here, because I've heard a lot of these stories. Somebody is exposed to pornography at a young age, and we're talking hardcore pornography here, not the soft porn we see on TV, but the hardcore stuff. At say 9 or 10 years old, you're a parent finds this material or whatever. What if they've not set up an environment beforehand, which has talked about this, if the children are not necessarily equipped to understand what it is that they're looking at, what does somebody do? Like, how do you manage that in a way that helps a child to understand and does not contribute to negative behavior potentially in future? Putting you on the spot, David.
Fine. I think what's important is, and I've had this a lot in practice with other professionals, is when we have a child who, I would argue, again, remove the blame, a child who's been sexualized through exposure to content, you know, in that way. I think what we have to remember is they can't unsee that content. They can't unsee the messaging that's been given through that content. So, an example for me would be if a young person, a child at that age, had been exposed to, let's say, something such as BDSM content or bondage, something really pretty extreme in terms of its acceleration of understanding the content. What we have to be really clear about is, yes, we didn't want a 9-year-old to see that. And we have to look at the issues around why a 9-year-old has been exposed to that. But for that child themselves, we need to help them process and understand what they've actually just seen, because there's an assumption that every child that looks at that wanted to look at that or enjoyed looking at that. Not always. I've worked with young people and children under the age of kind of 12 who have been exposed potentially and by older siblings who have potentially shared a bedroom, etc. So there hasn't been an intentional exposure to the material by the sibling, but actually by being in the very nature of that environment and in that shared space, they've seen something. They didn't like it. They found it scary. They couldn't understand why people would do that to each other. So we then have to fill that narrative and we have to help them understand a little bit more about what happens, the why, and explore that with them to reinsure and reinforce safety. And also to give that message of, I think, really clearly and explicitly the consent element. So for me, the content that we're describing there in terms of BDSM, the BDSM culture in the adult world is probably one of the most safest and consensual kind of sexual groups you can find. It's based on consent, safe practice, sexual health. So there's a lot of really positives to that. Pornography doesn't show any of that. Pornography just shows the extreme, the exciting end of that behavior.
Yep.
And that's the bit I think that's really important that we help children understand. And I think I've seen so many young people receive even sexual injury by trying to copy something they've seen in pornography because they haven't been shown about how you prepare your body to do things, how you understand somebody wants that or doesn't want that, the safety elements to it. And I think those are really key themes that are prevalent. And you have to be really confident in having those conversations with a 9-year-old. And I think I say it again, if we're not confident about talking about healthy sexual behaviour, then I would challenge anyone that would try and have that conversation and do it well without being able to feel shamed themselves or shame the child. So I think once they've seen it in a nutshell, Nancy, I think we have to be able to respond to that in the best possible way and give them that safe outlet to explore it and question what they've just seen.
And I think your comments are super important to demonstrate that banning pornography is a non-starter. That's not a position that's going to be helpful because it's just not going to happen. There's way too much money in it. It's a business. It's a extremely lucrative business, and as quote unquote wrong as many aspects of it may be, it doesn't matter. It's just going to be there. So I'm hearing you say that we need to find ways to work with. Yes, if there's opportunities to minimize certain messaging coming out of pornography, yes, let's go down that route. Let those groups of people try and minimize that messaging. The rest of us, out here in the world, need to increase our ability to recognize these things and communicate about these things and learn how to be, as you say, confident in communicating with our children. And I think that's a really important message to reinforce, that those who want to simply ban pornography, it's going to be very, very challenging for that. I mean, like I say, it's a non-starter argument, I think.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I mean,
And I
when,
think,
go ahead.
sorry, Nancy, I think the other bit is I think it's not about holding that expectation on a parent because I think this really brings us back to talking about the family. Dependent on a parent's kind of psychosexual history and experience themselves will depend their ability to do that. So,
Mhm.
and I think, for example, of families that sex is a very biological thing, it's not something, and it's very a conservative family. It's very much sex is something that's biological. It's what we do to reproduce. You won't have those conversations about why sex is actually quite an enjoyable thing. So dependent on a parent's experience of that from their kind of life, childhood as well, will depend how comfortable and safe they feel to be able to have those conversations. So I think it's important not to blame parents. I don't envy parents at this moment in time in terms of the content, the accessibility to things that people have. But again, we have to be really open to, from my perspective, it's something in a practice place when something goes wrong, such as SSA in a family home, we need to understand what is the parent's resource pack internally, what's in their toolkit, what will allow them to talk about this, and what will prevent them from talking about it. So I think that's a really important theme.
Absolutely. I think though that um in a practice context, absolutely, you have the capacity to, on a sort of a one-to-one basis, or in a detailed basis, support parents and support them in their journey. But for those parents you never see, who will never come into your space, who SSA may never be part of their family's experience, how do we, or how does society support our families to be, I don't like the term better, but to be more and to be more equipped to do what you and I know needs to happen, which is parents feeling more confident, regardless of their psychosexual history, to learn how to move beyond or deal with their own things, so that perhaps they can contribute to this conversation and be speaking to their kids openly and appropriately, starting very early age, before SSA even begins. What do you think needs to happen to support families in that way, and to have even society reduce its stigma to this whole concept, which you said so well earlier when you talked about when we put the word child and sex in the same sentence, it freaks people out. Like, what do we need to do as a society to change how we approach our families in this regard?
I think that's again brings back the point around language. I think what we have to do is keep narratives and dialogues really open. You'll be aware as well, I've been involved in so many conversations and arguably debates at times about the use of language. As a professional network, we can't even agree a terminology for sibling sexual abuse. So I think we have to acknowledge that and acknowledge that there's a complexity there. But I think what we also have to do is ensure that we're listening to, like we say, that lived experience voice, taking that in and thinking, okay, what messages do we need to give the media? What messages should we be putting out there? And I do think one of the big things that will prevent that is the othering. If we consistently keep othering children and putting them into boxes and brackets of harmed and harmer, I think that's going to cause issue. I think what we have to do is look above that and look at actually fundamentally what we have is two children that something has went significantly wrong and so far away from the developmental norm of family life that this has occurred. And I think that is the point. And I do think if we start to look at this and get the buy-in from health agencies, health organisations to really promote this as a health issue, I do believe that will increase people's feeling safety of disclosure. I think it will give parents a better support mechanism in terms of looking at it from health. Because some parents, again, their experience of police and social work might have been horrendous growing up, and I think even when I first started my career, I started as a prison officer. And I remember being in the uniform, and that uniform could cause a significant barrier between me and someone else. And actually, it was originally I used to think, oh, they just hate people, and they hate us. It wasn't that. They were actually terrified of us at
Mhm.
times. And I think even a lanyard, a social work lanyard, can be a sign of absolute fear. Whereas typically we associate in society health professionals as being there to help and there to support. So I do think there's a real role there for us to increase kind of avenues with health, to try and make this more accessible and demystify and take away the demonization of it and look at it to get really to the heart of the harm and the abuse.
I like what you said about the lanyard, which, for those who don't know that term, is that ribboned name badge that hangs on people's necks. And I like that because I've always seen those as a mark of some degree of power in a room. If somebody's wearing a lanyard, we're denoting them as having some kind of power or knowledge that we don't have. And I've always thought they name badge, sure, whatever, but a lanyard seems to sit differently on somebody's body for some reason. I don't know. It's kind of weird, but um, I am hopeful myself that in future we will be talking about sibling sexual abuse across the board, across most jurisdictions, as a health issue, the same way that we talk about heart health, brain health, gut health, and these sorts of things. And yes, that might be quite wishful thinking, but I do believe in, and many experts who know a hell of a lot more than me about, for example, brain development, adolescent brain function, confounding factors of healthy brain development, will generally agree that one of the primary factors in sibling sexual abuse is brain development, brain function, and which can be either helped or hindered by the environment. So you have that nature nurture kind of conversation going on in general terms. And I'm
Yeah.
hopeful that then when we're starting to talk about it, society will have a different viewpoint. The thing is that in order for us to have that different narrative about it, we need society's buy-in sooner rather than later. We need society to begin to see that these conversations are a health conversation. If not before something happens, certainly afterwards. Because one of the things, regardless of the abusive behavior that may occur, the impacts are similar across the board. So some denote problematic sexual behavior as being things like knowingly exposing your younger sibling to pornography. That's sort of on in one area of the dialogue. In another area of the dialogue is the more horrendous, dramatic, salacious in terms of media, sort of repeated violence and rape and things like that. So there's that whole sort of group of behaviors that people would classify as being abusive. The impacts of all of it are the same in many respects. So somebody who was exposed to pornography knowingly by an older sibling who was just being an ass at the time, and as you say, that child of 6 or 7 years old can't unsee the images. It's with them for a really long time, et cetera, et cetera. Those things can create levels of anxiety, PTSD-like behaviors, real confusion for that child as they grow up. And it can have the same type of impact then than somebody who has had really abusive sexual contact with a sibling. So it is a health issue beforehand, potentially as, the confounding factor of brain development, lack of coping strategies, the environment within which that brain is developing, et cetera, et cetera. All the way through to after the impacts being anxiety, depression, self-harm, all these things we know are involved with child abuse for both the person harmed and the one who has harmed.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can get that narrative out to society and see SSA in a context of health rather than in a context of crime.
And I think it's wide, Nancy, and I think you've highlighted that point as well of that tightrope. And one of the examples I always give is, as society, when we look at a child at 10 years old, we acknowledge, and a lot of us, arguably the mainstream, would acknowledge that a child at 10 can't do a lot of things. So we decide for a child, potentially when they go to bed at 10, we don't feel that they're able to walk to school alone. We don't acknowledge them as being able to get on a bus on their own and go into town. But when that 10-year-old commits an act of violence or harm, we have a high expectation that they can take accountability and display empathy. And I find that concept really complex, that actually we have acknowledged that these children don't have the ability yet to do certain things. But one of arguably the most high-end things in terms of accountability and display empathy, the terms take responsibility, we just immediately expect that child to do that. And that is not going to happen. That's not reality. And I don't speak as an apologist in any matter of means. I acknowledge and I've supported criminal justice processes in some instances of sibling sexual abuse, where I've seen a minority, but actually that minority is actually there is no necessary reunification support that I would deem as appropriate. And actually it has been very much a crime that's been committed, and it's the level of harm and violence that's been prevalent is well out with the barrier of even kind of looking at any other approach. That doesn't mean that individual doesn't still require the same health support alongside the justice support, but it's just a very different approach. So I do acknowledge that at times some of these conversations can be misinterpreted. And I think it's important that people, see that as actually what we're defining here is very much from the same agenda. It's just about looking at it in terms of the concepts, and thinking, what support does each individual need? And ultimately, the ultimate aim, whatever side, if you sit on another inside, what is going to ultimately heal this family? And I think, aid recovery. So yeah, I think those are just really kind of important points to raise, really.
No, absolutely. And what I would like to see personally is the sort of 80-20 rule that currently seems to exist in most jurisdictions, that 80% of the time we need to look at something, a SSA or a behavior related to SSA as criminal. The first thing we do is slap the criminal code on it 80% of the time, and 20% of the time the child who's causing harm is so young that they really didn't, like, we can easily say, oh, we understand that they didn't know what they were doing. I would like to see that flipped in terms of, let's look where appropriate from a health point of view, pre and post, quote unquote, behaviors, and where appropriate, absolutely look at something that's through the criminal justice lens. I don't, and you'll agree, and most people will agree, there is no one size fits all answer. But I do know that we tend to, as you were saying, we tend to other, we tend to blame, we tend to make our lives simple by ensuring that there's a monster in every storyline. We tend to deny. This is what humans do generally on most topics. So it's no surprise that in something that is deemed to be complex, and even as we say, the professionals don't have unified language around it, so it's confusing. So complex and confusing, when you have anything that is complex and confusing, you usually have humans go into the easiest way of dealing with it, which is just to ignore it. So the more we can sort of simplify the messaging and the language, the more we can be unified in an approach more often than not. I think the more likely it will be that society will buy in and say, yeah, I'm less confused now, so now I want to be engaged. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that is, really one of the main points of it. And I think you almost, like, when you're in this field, you have a responsibility, to really promote this and internally to the outside world. And I think also what I'm really clear on is actually let victims and survivors tell us what they need. So what the criminal justice system doesn't do in this context is acknowledge cases where potentially, and I've worked with these cases, siblings will say, actually, where's my brother or sister been taken to? Where are they going? They actually didn't necessarily all want that person removed. They wanted the harm or the abuse to instantly stop, but they didn't necessarily want that family to separate. Now, that obviously needs a lot of exploration and as into the why. But for me, what's important is for us to understand the minute we engage in a criminal justice procedure or we start to go into court systems, we immediately shut down the dialogue of therapeutic intervention, because actually at that point we're often told anything you disclose will go to court, and it becomes a justice process. So therapy even turns into justice, and that's wrong. I think that isn't ethically correct, and I think that's the point. And what we've also done there is we've completely minimized the victim's ability to tell us what they want. I get really frustrated when I work with certain groups, and there's often that discussion around, can they cope? Can someone cope? And my argument to that is, what a victim potentially is experiencing in life is far more horrific than what you're about to talk about for the next 20 minutes. And I think, that's the bit that really annoys me, is that we still, again, we see victimization as something that's vulnerable and protected. Well, there's some of the most powerful people I've ever worked with as victims of sexual crime, and I think that's the point, is give that voice back to the people that actually should be making those decisions. And their decisions aren't always criminal justice. So, I think that's a point that, again, we must get out there.
I agree. I've seen lots of stories in the story portal and also in people that I've spoken to that they didn't want their sibling taken away. And as you say, there might be reasons why that need to be investigated for sure. But for the most part, I think we can trust that child or that young person saying, no, no, I don't want them to go. I just want to be safe. I just want them to, stop the behavior and to recognize what they've done has been hurtful to me. I think even as adults, I hear that over and over again from adults. All I want my sibling to do is sincerely recognize how their behavior has hurt or disrupted my life or fundamentally changed my life, and just to give me a sincere something. That's their definition of quote unquote justice, which brings us back to even, we put a justice system in place so that the survivor feels justice. Well, tossing your sibling into jail or removing them permanently from the home might not be the justice that the lived experience person has, right? Going back to your point. So I'm pleased to see that now more and more programs are being developed with the lived experience voice being sought. Whereas before it was, a bunch of research done, theories put together, programs put into place, and then we measure whether or not it was successful. So another person that I've spoken to for the Awareness Day is Paula Lobos in Chile, and they have developed a model of intervention there to support the person who caused harm. But in order to, and the rest of the family too, but in order to develop the model, they started with those who have lived experience and got their feedback on, what were the factors involved? What did you think? All these sorts of things, and started to build this sort of zipper approach of, you tell us, we'll build something, we'll test it. You tell us, we'll build something. And it's had great response because lived experience was sought. And that's why, to me, the lived experience voice is seeing it getting more and more volume, I think is super important. The other thing that I think I just want to touch a little bit more on is how we see, let's say we're having a conversation 5 years from now. I'm about to put you on the spot again, David. We're having a conversation. You're on the Awareness Day 2029, okay? And we are sitting down to talk about what's happened in the last 5 years. Fill in the gap of what you'd like to see happen as it relates to society's understanding of this topic and where things are going in future. What would you like to be able to say?
I think one of the points that I made earlier around the kind of othering, I'd like to see an increase in services, particularly within the kind of third sector or charity sector, that openly support whole family approaches. I think I would really like to see more of that. And even for organisations that aren't comfortable potentially doing that work themselves, acknowledging it and actually acknowledging and working together within this really close-knit sector, that actually there is organisations that are holding this piece for people and trying to support whole families. So I think that's really important. The other point I think is important is for the next 5 years, I think we've got a massive responsibility in terms of how sibling sexual abuse is perceived. And one thing that does slightly concern me, and this is almost a repeat of history. Years ago, there was various campaigns in the UK around child sexual exploitation, so CSE, and a lot of those campaigns visually. So if we think kind of more in terms of media psychology and things, the visuals of them were very heavily gendered. And even in terms of the narratives, the case studies, they were all very gendered, showing a high level of female victimization, which we knew was the most prevalent. The point to that is, though, we have to consistently keep doors open. So when we do that, and similar to sibling sexual abuse, if we start running lots of stories and lots of campaigns, videos, and scenarios and dramas that all dictate female victimization, we actually start to shut the door to what happens when boys are exposed to sibling sexual abuse. And as a victim, do we start to acknowledge that actually these organizations have been gendered by the traction that it's gained in terms of the media. And I think that's a real danger zone. I think we have to be careful of that. And I also think we have to just see children as children. So actually, for me, the gender, aspect of that is really important, but we also have to let children be children and society see children as children. But I think ensuring that, there's been a lot of discussion in the UK, around CSE, and that's shifted a lot. But that was from a lot of hard work from organisations such as Barnardo's, who at one point published reports such as Not on the Radar, Not Just a Girl Thing. But that just showed the level of money that and funding and resourcing that had to go in to quite quickly change society's attitudes. If that campaign had been started from a non-kind of gendered perspective at the beginning, potentially we wouldn't have to have done that bit. So I think it's a really important theme that's important to mention.
Absolutely. And you're touching on another topic I want to sort of discuss it a little bit more before we wrap up, and that's the idea of media's responsibility. And media responds to what organizations want to put together. Generally speaking, people buy ad space or whatever, they pay for commercials, and media just puts it out there. I still also believe, though, that media has a degree of responsibility to look at the programs they're willing to support. And I never saw Game of Thrones. It's not my thing anyway, but then when I heard the storyline that denotes a brother-sister relationship, it's just like, no, that's not for me, particularly when people gave me details of the way that it's done. And the other thing we know about media is that it tends to focus on salacious items. It tends to focus on things that are quote unquote thrilling or highly dramatic and really capture people's attention. One thing media is long known is that you cannot have a television program that's full of good news stories. Nobody wants to see good news stories for whatever reason, unfortunately. And those that in many respects that have tried to just be all about good news is they fail. And like on the evening news here in my jurisdiction, we have all the news from around the world and locally, and it's all all these bad things that happen, and then there's like 2 minutes on right at the end of the show something good. So media sort of has this responsibility, almost going back to the beginning of the conversation with the great article that the Sunday Times did, but it lent into that criminal justice narrative, which sells papers. The hidden crime of sibling sexual abuse. Well, that sells papers. And so how do you think media, again, waving your magic wand, you've got control of the media in the United Kingdom and anywhere else you choose. What would you like to see media actually do? In reality, like being realistic, what would you like to see media doing, say, in the next 3 to 5 years in relation to sibling sexual abuse?
Yeah, I mean, I'm someone that spends his life trying to run away from media, so that's probably a really interesting question and I think there's something in that. The minute I hear, so even when the paper came out in terms of the weekend, and we were named, the organisation was named in one sentence within the article, I immediately go to that place of shock. What have they said? What's happened? I think of it as a really scary thing. And I think there's something in that for us to really reflect on, because actually the reason for that being is usually the media is there to shock or to sell shock factors, and I think there's that thing around it. Like you said earlier, nobody's going to read about that continuum of behaviour. People want to read about the shock and the horror. And I think there's something really concerning and disturbing about society in that respect. Even looking at, when we think of social media and TikTok, some of the most highly viewed material or videos are of the most violent nature, So there was one not a few years back when an individual had committed suicide live on a streaming app. The millions of views that it actually had within minutes was terrifying, because there's a shock factor, there's something shocking about it. And I think what we've got to be really careful is that's fine if that's what society currently wants to see and hear, but that's not going to help us. That's not going to move this in, and it isn't going to help families. So I think what we have to do is almost, as I say, is remove that criminal perspective and that narrative of danger and violence, and actually look at this as a real issue in terms of the health piece that we've mentioned, but also which will allow families to be safe and be in a place to feel safe to disclose the harm. So I think for us, we've got a responsibility to work with the media. I think also in our services, we really everything we do goes through kind of lived experience action groups in some capacity, and I think I've always struggled when people say about lived experience, because I think the point is lived experience shouldn't just be used to tick our boxes. It should be used to make change and actually make it meaningful. And I think that's the point. So for me, that article was a good example of that, in terms of it clearly, you could see it from the core, the values and the stories that had came from people's narratives that was embedded within that. And I thought that was a really progressive start in terms of that agenda going forward. So I think really it is about us taking accountability and responsibility in this field and working with the media to really try and understand this, because I think even the recent kind of drama over here that's starting to use a case and a scene around sibling sexual abuse, my knowledge of that is that many have been consulted with that. As you said earlier, Nancy, that wouldn't have happened before, really. They would have, taken a random case and thought that's something, and ran it without consulting with people. And I think that's a really positive sign that we're actually seeing some consultation within these sectors now as well.
Yes, I agree that the partnering with media and bringing academia, professional practice, and lived experience advice and consultations to media people, I think is super important. It's also good to remember that given what we know, even with the limited research about sibling sexual abuse specifically, but also child sexual abuse and other forms of trauma, most of the people that, or not most, many people who work in media are in fact themselves have been exposed at one level or another to sibling sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, or whatever, right? The people who work in these domains are familiar with it from a lived experience concept themselves, even if it was farther out in their family somewhere. And I don't know if they always think of that when they're putting their storylines together. So hopefully that will come to pass as more lived experience people and professional practice are used in a consultative manner. One thing for me, when you were talking, I'm not familiar with that, the social media thing that you're talking about, someone who committed suicide on social media, but I'm very familiar with, excuse me, somebody who murdered somebody live on Facebook, and how many views that got. And I have in my own behavior, and this is more a message to society as a whole, I have recognized that at times I hear about something and my first response is, oh, I must go look that up. And then it's like, no, hang on here. Why do I don't need to look that up. I don't need to be a lemming. I don't need to see these things. And I don't need to support. There are people who are driven to do these things live because of all the likes they're going to get in that sort of like zombie type fashion. They just, I want the likes, so I'm going to do something extreme. I don't need in my daily behavior to support things which are counterproductive to a healthy society. And neither does anybody else in society. We don't need to buy into these things that are just salacious and egregious and there to sell papers or there to sell, you know, to get likes, which is a form of currency for many people. So I encourage people myself, as often as possible, to question their reasoning for why it is they need that far extreme topic to be in their face. And is
Yeah.
it more, is there something else they need to be doing to fill whatever need that is, whatever need that's filling. And I think, again, that's a message that lived experience folks can bring to media and encourage media to share. It is in many ways, I think this whole concept of media and the relationship between media and society and any topic like sibling sexual abuse, child exploitation, that relationship is in many respects, I think, quite complex. But there is a simplicity in my mind as well, and I'd love your thoughts. There's a simplicity that what society seems to want, media will fill, but media also tries to determine what society needs. You see that in marketing. The fundamentals of marketing is you get somebody to buy something that they don't actually need. They buy into something that they don't actually need because it's so competitive out there. And that relationship that seems to be codependent can only be broken if somebody says, I'm not going to buy into that. Do you feel that in terms of this specific sort of media, society, and topic of point, in this case, SSA, do you think there's hope in that relationship can become either broken from anything that's destructive, so we can break that relationship, or that it will mature and grow into something that's more positive, where every member of that conversation, every member of that relationship will understand their responsibility within it? Big question.
Yeah. I, I think there's a few bits to that. I think in terms of social media, I think it's incredibly difficult in terms of how do we ever get to a place or a position to police that, and also incorporate kind of freedom of speech. I think that's a real issue, and I do wonder if there is that actually a role for social media to give that message? Maybe not. Potentially social media is always going to be that tool, very powerful tool, that people have that space. And I believe in freedom of speech very clearly. And I think there's things I hear that I think I fundamentally disagree with, but that doesn't always mean I don't get the concept. So, even the debate around language, we've had it so many times around this work. It's not that I ever go into a position of, well, actually, I've got this and I know this. What I want to understand more is explore the use of language and explore it. So I think similar to social media, sometimes when something doesn't necessarily fit our agenda, I think there is a bit of professional and societal kind of behavior that sometimes I don't like, in terms of, well, it doesn't fit what we believe in, so we can't associate with it at all. I think we have to be more open to each other's concepts, and actually when something comes out within reason that actually maybe we don't agree with, it's maybe about us having productive conversations, even like this, Nancy, in terms of two people getting down and actually having those conversations about unpicking and unpacking some of that content. So I think social media is tricky to do that. I think, like you say, there is a real need for me in terms of, particularly in journalism and the kind of mainstream media, to really have a bit of accountability. So in this country as well, at the moment, I would argue that the political agenda feeds into this topic. So even the right wing agenda, where actually there's so many debates that I think are fundamentally wrong, around, inclusive sex education, when children should be told what and why, you know, informed by, I would argue, uneducated politicians, who really, I don't understand why they have a place in this debate or conversation in the first place. But these are people making massive decisions about our lives that actually are really ill-informed and often filled with ideology. I think that needs challenging. I think, there's a role there for us to challenge that as a much wider society, to really indicate what we should be saying and why. Because these agendas don't help. They shut down the narrative once again, because they make it scary and they make people frightened. So I think it's very difficult. But like I say earlier, in terms of the Times article, as I mentioned, yeah, I thought it was really a progressive start. I think it's got it into the mainstream. I noticed on LinkedIn, and I can't remember who said it, but they said it's now out. That was the words, it's now out. And I loved that, because I thought, yeah, it is. It's out as a standalone entity, and actually now society's got to look at this and listen. So I think for that reason, there's a number of things that I really liked. As I mentioned, there's bits I didn't particularly feel were helpful, but that's okay because
Mm.
we're never going to all agree. And dependent on where we are, depending on our own experiences, depends on how we portray that. But for me in general, I think it's about supporting each other, to make sure that we can come together to ultimately do what we're trying to do, no matter what route we're coming from.
And all roots are valid roots, and all opinions
Yeah,
are valid opinions for people to share and to
absolutely.
explore, and to we can all grow from listening to what everybody has to say, and sharing ideas. I don't like to only have one train of thought. I am a person that I tend to like to have my thoughts challenged, and even if what that does is by me having to take my stand to reinforce my thinking, but also being open to what other people have to say and how to view things. And particularly in the topic of sibling sexual abuse, I think that is part of the answer. And you've said it several times, and others do as well. We need to be listening to each other. We need to not just shut the door on other people or put it on the other side of the tracks or just down that street over there, or and not push it away, but actually be more open. So as we wrap up, and a fascinating conversation, which I know I could go on about far too long. Um, what is there anything that you think we've missed, or an important point that you want to share with the audience that you think sort of rounds up what we've been talking about, even though that would be very hard to do in a couple of sentences?
No, I think just a thank you for having me along again to speak to this. It's something I'm incredibly passionate about, and I suppose to continue to keep that door open. If there is people that are listening and there's some things here that we want to explore further, I'd be very open to having those conversations. I think that's the key to this, is let's just keep this open. And as we've mentioned in the last bit about, where we don't agree, let's not put barriers up between each other. Let's actually work together to understand why we don't agree, and what that looks like. Because it may be that actually we are both trying to go to the same place. We've just maybe never thought about it from a different perspective. So I think it's really important that we work as a really close group, and continue to promote and work really and as an activist, really, in terms of promoting this work. So yeah, so a huge thanks to you, Nancy, for everything you do, and how I think as well bringing everything together internationally, which is something I've got a massive kind of appreciation for. So thanks.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you and on the call today, David. And the work that you and Thriving Survivors are doing, I think, is amazing. And taking that holistic approach is really the way forward. And it's great to see you leading the way in doing that. So thank you very much for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.